Hello, welcome to AT&T ThreatTraq for March 15th, 2016. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. Today we're joined by Michael Singer. Michael, you're a security architect here in our Chief Security Office. Tell us a little bit about what you do.
So I've been in different roles in CSO, most recently in working with customers, and I had the opportunity this year to join our entertainment group team, get to know them, work with them on some of their projects, and I'm really looking out now for the whole integrated AT&T, what the entertainment group's doing along with what AT&T is doing. How can we, make those work together very well?
Oh, very good. So when you're referring to entertainment, are DirecTV partners, or we're integrating as a part of the organization?
Absolutely. We're right in the middle of, folks moving in both directions, learning from each other.
Yeah. Well, I think it's good to point out that my personal observation has been we've had a lot of good complementary capabilities between the organizations, and we're bringing those together. So glad to have you back. It's been some time since you've been on the program. So
glad to be here.
All right, good. We have Joe Harten with us here today. Welcome, Joe.
Thanks.
And John Hogoboom.
Back again. Like a bad penny, I keep turning up.
And I'm Brian Rexroad. And I guess for the first thing here, we got some fan mail or phang mail, John?
Well, however you want to say it, I guess this is just an open invitation. We love people to email us, and we don't get a lot of email. This isn't, maybe it sounds a little desperate to say that, we'd like to get some fan mail, but unfortunately we get a lot of usually junk mail and spam in our ThreatTraq at list.at.com. And this was just one that came in today that I thought was entertaining because it actually is a Apple phish where they were phishing for credentials, and it actually said best regards from Tim Cook, CEO. I guess the one comment that I would make about it is when you actually look at the URL, and I did stick it down here at the bottom, it is so long and obfuscated that if you were to look at it in your browser, you might not notice that it's not really Apple that you're going to. They threw a lot of random characters in there to string out the fully qualified domain name to a really long domain name.
Right. Yeah, well, and for somebody that's not necessarily technically trained, they might not realize that the domain name ends with a slash mark as opposed to a period. And so there you have that, www.appleid.com.id, and then a big long number and a whole bunch of other gobbledygook that's in there. Ultimately, it gets to that swpaland lords.org domain name, which is really the malicious, basically all of that is sort of a malicious domain name that's been set up. So just an example, I think that's, and I think one of the things that it's been some time since we pointed out is that sometimes these domain names are designed so that in a mobile device, the URL extends way past that little screen that you have the opportunity to take a look at. I think you can kind of put your finger down on it and just hold it on there and safely, see what the full URL is and see if you really trust it before you actually browse to it.
But if you're not paying attention, you could get fooled into giving up your credentials to these websites. And it's a convincing enough looking web page that they put together. So.
Yep, absolutely. So the proper countermeasure in this case is if somebody's asking you to verify your credentials, is just go separately instead of following the link in the email. Go to your browser directly, go to the website directly, log in, make sure everything's good. But in this particular case, I found it kind of ironic that they, it was a commitment to your privacy, and then it says, we want you to take a look at your data. So very unusual request that you would ever see in actuality. So very entertaining examples. So Michael, we'll go to you next, and I guess you're going to give us a little bit of history of denial of service attacks.
I wanted to kind of reflect back on denial of service attacks, and we call some of them reflection attacks, really amplification attacks. But we've been working to prevent or to block or to deal with DDoS attacks of all shapes and sizes for quite a while. And I was thinking back to when a gigabit per second seemed like a lot of traffic, and now you see 100 gig and it happens every day, so things have changed a lot. And then some of the things that have developed that I think are interesting and help you understand the threat better are that originally you had to compromise your own systems and then use those systems to attack your victim.
Speaking from the attacker's point of view.
From the attacker's point of view. And they would send traffic directly from that bot to the target. And then over time we saw a lot of things change. So one of the things that changed was kind of the as a service model in the attack space. Everything as a service these days, right? So the ability to rent bots by the hour or by the minute even. And then there's a price, and over time the price has come down. The use of toolkits, so that if you have a certain type of attack and it doesn't seem to be giving you the results you want, you click a different button, menu driven, and then the traffic changes, so the people defending might have to put some countermeasures in. But then we found out it was this amplification. So instead of sending traffic from me to my target, I'm going to get a lot more traffic to go to that target by spoofing that I'm them in the return address and then doing all these lookups. And domain name services, big answers, to the request. So what happens to people who are providing DNS services is all of a sudden you have all this probing from attackers, and it's odd because the better your infrastructure is, the more robust it is, the more capable it is, the more interesting it is, and the more they want to use your infrastructure in their attacks. So I think that was kind of an interesting thing to see. And then there was this, all of a sudden, something new for them to look at, and that was network time protocol. So these network time servers, internet facing, ask for the time the right way, huge answer. So just recently, some researchers in the UK said, hey, there's something that amplifies even better than DNS or NTP, and that's this trivial FTP server, simplified FTP server. And guess what? There are a lot of them on the internet. They counted close to 600,000 of them. Unlike network time and domain name services, they don't have to be on the internet, probably shouldn't be on the internet. But the fact that they're there means they could be leveraged. And they quoted 60 times amplification. And what immediately happened was people paid attention to this research, and we have some data to show you that, hey, they're interested and they're looking for these servers, and maybe they're going to be using them to carry out larger amplification of attacks, leveraging this type of TFTP server.
Yeah. Before we go to that, let's rewind just for a moment here, because I think there are a couple of things that are worth discussing a little bit further. You mentioned the DNS. And so one of the problems is that if somebody has DNS servers on the internet, they can be used to facilitate amplification attacks. Now, generally those cases are referred to as open DNS servers. And John, I don't know if you have any comments on this, but there are some things that you should do on a DNS server to keep them from being abused in this way.
Well, yeah, I mean, when you set up your DNS server, if it doesn't need to be a recursive resolver, which basically means that it will answer anybody's DNS query. Normally, if you're going to put a DNS server on the internet, it's for authoritative purposes, because I have my own domain name, and I'm only going to announce domain names with respect to my domains that I am hosting. But people put these out, they're probably just not thoughtfully setting them up and deploying them, and they're set up as recursive resolvers, and then they get abused by people in these recursive attack type of things.
Yep, absolutely. So if you're doing an authoritative server, you should control exactly what it's answering. And if you actually are intending to have a recursive server, you really should have some controls to control who you really want to be able to use your DNS server. Otherwise, the attackers are going to be abusing it. And then I guess a third mechanism, relatively new in DNS bind, is the ability to put rate controls in place. So you won't get lots and lots of requests for the same thing and be answering it, just completely blindly.
And I was going to also mention there are a lot of devices, Internet of Things devices that people deploy that they don't realize are acting as the DNS resolver on the internet-facing side. So sometimes that's very hard to discover on your own. There are probably test tools out there you can use to have it come back and try to test your network, pinging you back and whatnot. But that is another situation that we've seen out there where it's, not so much a misconfiguration by the user, but just bad design by some appliance or piece of hardware that you're deployed in the network.
Yeah, good point. And not necessarily plug in any particular service, but Shodan may be able to provide that kind of insight. So if you know your internet-facing IP address, just do a quick lookup on there, see what services it looks like are showing up. And
I think there's an openresolvers.org website as well that'll test you back as well.
Yep. So so that's the DNS piece of it. So there are things that people should be doing, and I think you know, to your point, John, we found that a lot of these devices, they may have, in fact, anything with like a Linux operating system on it is probably going to require some locking down before it should be put on the internet. Things like network time protocol, DNS, even some other protocols like character generator, they're going to show up that have been traditionally used in these amplification attacks. So very important that we get those things locked down. NTP in particular had basically a bug associated with it where you could, you know, ask it a question. It would tell you everything that it ever did in the last, you know, so long.
And I'm going to throw one more thing out before we jump over to a slide. But I think it's BCP 38. So if you are an internet service provider, one way...
Anybody with BGP.
Or anybody with BGP, or right, if you're managing your own network. One of the things, there's the BCP 38 spec, you can read up on it, but basically what it's doing is if I have my own network and I know what my IP addresses are on the inside, in order for reflection attacks like these, DNS, NTP, to work, you have to spoof. So as an attacker, I got to spoof the source IP out through the network. But if I'm controlling and I can tell, hey, that's not one of my IP addresses on the inside, you can block those spoof packets and prevent them from getting out to the resolvers themselves and the reflection from occurring in the first place.
Yep.
So
don't allow spoofed addresses on your network.
Right.
It's a big deal. All right. So perhaps now we should look at the TFTP activity and see what's going on here. Do you care to comment, or shall I?
Go for it.
Okay. So basically what we're showing here are scan probes that are showing up on port 69 UDP. This is the port that is used by trivial FTP, or file transfer protocol. And as you can see, you know, there have been some probes there in the past, but certainly the density and the intensity of the probing activity has increased. There would seem to be sort of a surge in the probing activity right around when this announcement was made last week. And I guess the other sort of observation here, perhaps at least as important, is we hadn't seen much source port activity on TFTP. It really doesn't get used all that much on the internet. It doesn't even have authentication, and so basically, if you have a system that's offering TFTP, it's not really providing very good control or access to that system. But nevertheless, what we are seeing is actually just in the last few days here, some activity that looks like reflective denial of service attacks using port 69 UDP or trivial FTP. And I didn't actually dig into this to see, you know, who the targets were, if it looked like it was actually test traffic or something along those lines, but it is getting up around into the gigabit per second range. So we're certainly going to need collectively to pay closer attention to this and see how it manifests itself and develops. So with that, Joe, let's go to you, and we'll talk about, I guess, Stamus is an organization that is on the basically protecting against denial of service attacks.
Right, they're supposed to be helping.
Yeah, they're supposed to be helping. So tell us a little about what the situation is.
This was in the news a lot this week. Krebs picked it up, Ars Technica, a bunch of others, but basically Staminus, this company out of California that does, protects companies against DDoS attacks, they were hacked. And so rather than them being, helping, they became vulnerable and their network was down for 20 hours. And as of this morning, their website was still down. They're bringing stuff up a little bit at a time, and they're saying that the web presence is non-critical at this point. But yeah, they acknowledged the activity over social media, and as they were sort of dealing with it and calling it a rare event, all of a sudden, all this leaked information was published by a group claiming to be the source and saying that they were able to re-image their routers, return them to default settings. And then the kind of really most interesting sort of outsider perspective is that the group claiming responsibility posted some tips, which it's kind of silly to us, but probably to the Staminus folks, it's just all the more embarrassing. They put a bullet list of tips saying, don't use a root password on all your machines, don't expose PDUs to the WAN, don't write your code with reckless abandon, which they spelled wrong, which is interesting. But really, they kind of, twisted the knife a little bit on the fact that they were able to penetrate a security firm's network, and it's a real high-profile thing for those of us in this community, because we know when you're doing the work to protect other customers, to have customer information and sensitive data pop up online because of stuff you didn't protect, it's really what we're trying to work against, and shows us that when you're building houses for people, you really should make sure they're not glass houses. So
there are some good recommendations here, to diversify the root passwords on systems so that,
right.
We generally refer to this as, what do we refer to? I'm drawing a blank at the moment. Well, there's certainly privileged access management, at least privilege associated with that. So thank you, Michael. And then, absolutely controlling, you want layers of security around your systems. You don't want to be exposing control systems to the internet. So that's obviously something that you want to be paying attention to. Trying to keep systems up to date, patched, particularly associated with vulnerabilities. And, you want to have basically a rating program to make sure that any critical vulnerabilities are put out. You want to manage it as a risk. The risk trade-off is some patches, you may be concerned about how it might interrupt systems, but other patches, they may be significant enough from a security standpoint that you want to push them out quickly and take the risk here. Certainly storing of credit card information and customer information, we be very careful about how that's done. It really needs to be encrypted, or at least even better, get rid of data that you don't really need. Right. So I think some recommendations were made about in another situation. I think it was what is the name of the company? The Ashley Madison case, where people were really trying to stay anonymous anyway. Right. And so there really wasn't a good reason that once you charge the credit card to actually keep the username and the credit card information. And so perhaps that's really the best thing to do, is at least mask it, if not get rid of it altogether. So so hopefully others can learn from the situation that Staminus had gone through here. Yeah. And I think another aspect of this that perhaps wasn't suggested directly is to have a business continuity plan. That is, if an application has been disrupted, to be in a position where you can restore the configuration and get started or go to a backup system. And I think more and more, disaster recovery has been thought of as a physical recovery, recovery from a physical type of disaster. Whereas I think now we really need to think about it in terms of if there were a malicious actor, and making sure that the systems are separated from a security point of view as well.
Malware and full network compromise, those things are just as destructive as something attacking your data center physically. So yeah.
So I guess I'm in some respects I'm actually applaud Staminus for being transparent from a media point of view. I think that provides more benefit for other organizations to learn from the experiences they've had, and hopefully they'll learn from it as well. All right, good. So, John, we'll go to you. I guess another situation here where I guess this is perhaps an exercise in threat analytics.
Yeah, there's a lot of breaches, let's say, and DDoS activity in this episode this week. But this is a story that came out, I guess last week or earlier this week, and the primary bank of Bangladesh had an event that occurred, and there's a lot of interesting aspects to it. So FireEye is assisting in the investigation, but what it looks like is there was some malware that was implanted, probably a month or more before they actually committed a theft from the bank. During that time, they might have done, the speculation that they did some, using a RAT, remote access tool, kind of watched how transactions were committed so they could get an understanding there. Although they suspect that whoever was behind this probably had some inside knowledge of how banking, financial transactions work. Because what they did here is the hackers stole the SWIFT credentials, which is, I guess, for like financial institutions to exchange data with each other, or transactions, which is not something how a normal person would go cash a check or conduct banking transactions. So far right now, there's no indications that there's insider involvement. Of course, they're still investigating that. The The amount of money is around 100 million, they're saying. They do know there was $80 million that was transferred to the Philippines, that was diverted to a casino or some casinos, and then from there it was diverted again to Hong Kong. And then there was 20 million that was directed to a nonprofit in Sri Lanka. The interesting thing was they misspelled some of the names for these financial transactions, which was one of the tip-off indicators that something is not quite right here. And they also tried to commit a rather large payment of 850 million that was, immediately stopped from being acted upon. So it's an interesting case. It's one of these ones where I'm sure there's a lot of other financial institutions that are very interested in understanding the particulars and specifics around how this occurred. How was this malware able to get onto a system that was able to, engage in this type of, high-level financial transactions? So there's some more learning opportunities, just like the, Joe's story with Staminus. A lot of people can learn from what is discovered there. There's probably some opportunities for learning here of how to better protect the banking and financial institutions from something like this happening again. So
yeah, I think perhaps one of the things that's worthy of considering here is, certainly there's a desire to be able to identify the presence of remote access tools. The fact that they call out and there might be some remote, basically some activity associated with that remote control activity that's taking place. And there's a certain amount of capability detecting that, but it's one somewhat difficult thing to do. And so once a remote access tool is present, I guess what we're really looking at is a system perhaps that is taking on the persona of what really would look like an insider attack. It is, it's a remote controlled system, but in this case here, some credentials have been stolen, and so it's taking on the persona of, some actor, and you wouldn't be able to distinguish whether it's an insider or whether it's an outsider if you don't know that remote access tool is there.
Right.
If that makes sense so far. And so what it kind of lends to is that in order to detect events like this, you really have to get closer to the application. And I think that's more and more the trend, is that recognizing anomalies in the transactions that are taking place and how those transactions, might manifest themselves. And so, we were debating about this a little bit earlier, whether $100 million is really an anomaly in transactions. Perhaps there were other anomalies that could have been detected in terms of where they went to, or the time of day, or something along those lines. I have no idea. Apparently something about 850 million was different. I don't know if it was the number or if it was where it was going, those types of things. But I think we're going to see more trends like this, where you still try to find that remote access, but there needs to be more emphasis on identifying anomalies in the transactions themselves. And that applies to both insider as well as, somebody that's trying to pretend to be an insider.
This also seems like a case where, a lot of times we're talking about really picking out malware, picking out specific things. This seems like a case where you might be able to develop some rules, some sort of automation that actually checks sort of a heuristic of what this behavior should look like. And, maybe it's one of the few cases where we really could automate something to block transfers like this, and not have to have the boots on the ground actually picking out the exact exploit. So.
And there are some commercial solutions that do things like this, like Silvertail is one that I'm aware of. Whether it would apply in this type of application, I don't know, but I know that they have solutions for web applications and how users interact with them, and they start to learn kind of behavior or profile normal activity, and when people deviate from that normal activity, it can trigger. Now, how well that works, I'm not a user of the system, but there are other solutions like that too that people could look into, probably.
Absolutely true. So I don't want to, pretend like we're, banking experts and what transactions are, but it's this trend, this notion that getting closer to the application. I think in Silvertail, for example, one of the mechanisms that it has is to recognize the normal sequence of events that you're supposed to go through as a part of a web transaction. If you try to skip steps along the way, it kind of knows that it's not a person and there's probably a robot behind it and trying to skip those steps. And those kinds of anomalies can be picked up as anomalies, and then the profiling of behaviors and that sort of thing as well. So I think this is again, just sort of the general trend, getting closer to the applications so that it complements the activity that can be detected at a network level or at a system level.
And as security analysts, it's not trivial because especially in large companies, there's a lot of different applications and they all operate differently. And I can go look for certain remote access Trojans because I know what they look like because they all kind of work similarly. But the applications, they all work differently, and I got to be an expert in that system in order to really write good rules to determine that this is not normal behavior.
Well, absolutely good point. I think the what that really requires is that there be a stronger partnership between the practitioners in identifying anomalies and the owners of particular applications or systems, which hopefully are well versed in the the types of transactions that should be taking place and being able to recognize abuses, and that partnership becomes more and more critical. Yeah. It's a challenge, but one that organizations should be thinking about.
Yep.
All right, Joe, let's go back to you and more malicious behavior and
so yeah, I mean we're talking about user behavior, and our friends in China are actually building a national surveillance data platform. I mean, to us this looks like a big data analytics platform, but they're basically using surveillance data to predict crime, criminal, terrorist activity. So their thought is if they can build this gigantic database of surveillance information and look for common behavior, profiles of behavior, that they could stop crime or terrorism in advance. We've all seen it in the movies. This is them actually coming forth and telling their citizens and the media what they're planning to do. Store a big data database of surveillance and calling information and money transfers, and try to do pre-crime, So I mean, there is some secrecy involved, and they're saying it's not big data. They call it a united information environment. But to me, it looks like big data. And
well, big data is sort of a like a.
Maybe it's an American term.
Well, I don't know if it's an American term, right? But it's it's one of these sort of cliche terms,
well,
and
true.
so
It's sort of lost its meaning.
Yeah. But nevertheless, I think this reminds me of Person of Interest. I mean, at least it conjures images like that. Yeah. I think there was actually one of the Batmans where they had this sort of this surveillance of everything and turned every cell phone into a surveillance system and that kind of thing. But I think this is probably where more activities are going to be taking place. In UK, I think there are a significant number of surveillance cameras that have been put around just for security around, and it maybe not aggregated into an analysis platform at this point, but that's really just a matter of, managing labor. You want to try to be able to do as good of a job as possible with as few people as possible, and so you put analytics around it to be able to support it. So on one hand, it's sort of the natural progression of things. On the other hand, it raises questions about, liberties and to what extent this is a good thing. You have to kind
of ignore the privacy and those sort of political impacts. But, on a scale, you could say this is exactly the model we use to look for threats. We have a data complex, we're doing profiling of user behavior, and we're trying to do predictive analytics. And why can't you use that to protect yourself as well? If we're looking at it for our corporate security, why can't we use it for national security? So, I mean, I think it's an interesting idea, and you do have to kind of turn that suspicious part of your brain off and just take the value of the technology in itself.
Yeah. Well, I think there are different views on whether it's a private organization doing it to protect certain things or a government doing, so there are different perspectives on those types of things. I don't want to get into a debate about what government should or shouldn't be doing, but I think that's perhaps some of the controversy or the debate around something like this. But again, it makes logical sense. The question will be whether actually is actually even effective in the first place. So let's go back to you, John, here. And this is a case where I guess there is no interface that's sacred.
Yeah, and well, and these are newer interfaces that
Yeah.
probably really haven't been thinking about before. But we've talked about, connected cars and some people who have tried to, directly attack cars themselves and the interfaces that they have. This is a little bit different, which I thought was interesting in that a researcher, Craig Smith, he's actually a part of a couple of different consortium groups that are trying to improve the security around automobiles and electronics within
This is
them.
white hat activity.
It's white hat activity. But he's moved from having some proof of concept to actually a lot more robust design here. So essentially what we're talking about though is it's a car that he has weaponized the car such that when the mechanic plugs into it with their computer, so when you bring it into the mechanic at the shop, they have a computer system that plugs in, and it can infect the computer system through the car. So it's a Trojan car, just kind of similar to how we always warn people about your USB thumb drive. If you find one, don't stick it in your computer because you could infect your computer. So in the same way, if you don't trust the car, not that this would be a normal circumstance, I would think, but it's an interesting kind of attack vector. He also has kind of shown that once he can pivot over to that mechanic's workstation, that actually can interface with a lot of different models of cars. So this is an agnostic type of attack, independent of whatever model the car is, and potentially can pivot and infect new cars as they plug in, and it acts as kind of the host infection vector at that point. And a lot of these mechanics computers can overwrite the firmware on cars, because that's one of the capabilities they have as part of their processes. So it's an interesting attack vector, one that hopefully isn't going to become a real problem, but it's definitely something you want to bring to light, that people should be thinking about and addressing.
Yeah.
So
what is the interface that they're using here? Do you know?
I'm not positive. I'm going to guess it's probably related to the ODB2 port, whatever that they have on there, because I think that's mostly how people interface with the automobiles, but I'm not positive. So
Right. And I think, my mindset had been, and I think partly because it kind of grew up as a relatively, kind of a mundane interface, and I think it's been becoming more sophisticated over time. That, originally when they started putting control modules in the cars, they had this old protocol where you'd hold the brake and turn the key and then let the brake off and then turn the key again or something, crazy thing. And then the display, the little engine service light would flash a few times, like there's your code. And then you go and figure out what the diagnosis problem. And now they've got, you plug it in and you've got the computers and it tells you all kinds of things about the history and things. And so it hadn't really kind of occurred to me that there might be a way that you could, and I'm assuming some sort of buffer overflow to be able to inject things into the computer and then be able to have it actually attack the diagnostic system, and be able to actually spread malware in that way. So it's good. It's somebody that is doing research and in the light of good
it's
is
a white
investigating
hat
this.
kind of, trying to say, hey, we should be paying more attention to this. Should get addressed. It's not like a real problem out in the world right yet.
And a bunch of IoT devices that could do this sort of distribution of malware this way, right? Like drones or anything that you could probably get something on. I guess you don't really plug a drone in, but if you put, say, like a Bluetooth on your drone, and he could push stuff out.
And there are attacks. Well, I mean, we're segueing, but there are ways to attack drones by spamming them with Bluetooth or interrupting the Bluetooth and Wi-Fi to them to get them to, and I think they even have somebody invented like a little sniper rifle that can take out drones using radio frequency.
Like a
a
radio gun.
Yeah, basically, yeah.
Yeah, so never at a loss for inventiveness. So let's take a look at the internet weather for the last week or so here, and the first thing we'll talk about here is actually scan sources on port 22 TCP. So this is over the last 90 days, just to give you an idea what the what is sort of typical activity. And we saw basically a surge in activity, and this is actually on March 7th was the first one. I think for the It was actually in the midst of the last internet weather report that we provided for you, and there was a subsequent spike going up around 5,000 sources. Not a huge number, but certainly a significant increase. And it looked like most of the sources were in China and Russia compared to what we're seeing as sort of a normal baseline of that 1,000 or so sources that are doing that scanning on port 22. Now, just to put this into perspective, I also took a shot at the last 2 years of activity, and there was a period of time where we were up around 3,000 sources, really kind of stable in that place. So there was clearly a botnet that was doing this scanning activity. I think, John, you had investigated this some time ago. This was actually a home router. There was, I think, the Artis. It was the.
You know what? I investigate so many things.
I
You
know,
got
you
me at a
investigate
loss. I don't remember doing it.
In any case, this was actually a particular brand of home router that was exposing port 22 to the internet. It may have been actually a configuration parameter or something along those lines, and we saw that there were a significant number of devices that were actually sourcing this scanning activity at the time. And you could see there was a decay associated with that over time. I'm not sure if that issue had been corrected, but nevertheless, it is less now than we had seen back then. Looking at the top 10 most probed ports at the top of the list here, first of all, we have a big other. A big other is, well, it's just that. There are a lot of other ports that are being probed. We don't usually report on other than the top 10 here, but in some cases we have anywhere between a few hundred to a couple of thousand sources that are doing probing activity, and in this particular, or actually being probed, and in this particular case, that's a large proportion of the pie chart. Nevertheless, at the top of the list, as usual, is port 23. Now, over the last several weeks, we've seen actually port 53413 on this chart, and it's not showing up today. That's probably a good thing. The port 23 is followed by port 22, and then followed by 1900 UDP, that's Simple Service Discovery Protocol, 443 TCP, SSL over the web, 445 TCP. We're going to take a quick look at that one a little bit later on. 3389 Remote Desktop Protocol, 143 TCP. That's actually jumped up a number of places here. That's IMAP, Internet Mail Access Protocol. And in this particular case, it's generally a research organization that's probing for that particular port, followed by 53 UDP, 80 TCP, and then 1911 TCP, which is actually an industrial control protocol. Again, usually a researcher organization, a white hat type activity that's doing that probing. Looking at scan probes on port 23 TCP, that's telnet. And we're actually at relatively the lowest, almost the lowest level over the last 6 months here. So we're looking at 180 days of activity, and the probing level is relatively low. We've had a few little dips in other places, but that's encouraging to see that level down. Although I don't think anything fundamentally has changed to make it, go lower. It's a possibility that whoever's doing the recruiting associated with these botnets feels that they've got enough resources already, and they don't feel need to be doing recruiting right now, which is obviously exposes them to some extent. So
we also had the spring break theory.
There was the spring break theory that perhaps somebody that's maintaining this botnet has better things to do than over the last week or so. So, and it's a legitimate possibility. So. The top 10 most sources doing the probing, well, port 23 is at the top of the list here. It's a good majority of that activity, followed by 53413. So the sources that are doing that 53413 activity haven't really gone down that much, but the amount of it has gone down. And then port 445 shows on this list. So let's take a little closer look at 53413. And this is looking over the last 6 months or the last 180 days of activity here, and you can see sort of the progression going along. It's a little bit lower than we've seen in the past, but still pretty aggressive activity, over 20,000 sources in any given hour that we see sending out those packets. That's a case where it's exploiting a netis router backdoor where the packet actually contains scripting commands, and if the device is vulnerable to that backdoor, it will execute those commands and then become part of that botnet. Looking at the last 2 years of activity on port 445 TCP, now most of this scanning activity is generally recognized or considered to be associated with the configure worm. That dates back a long time, right?
Several years back.
Yeah, that's probably the last big, at least Microsoft-based worm that was out there, and a lot of activity was done to try to fix this problem. It has been going down. Back in about August timeframe last year, we saw sort of a drop in activity. I don't have a good explanation for that drop, and there still is sort of a a downward trend there overall, but still a long ways to go before we get rid of that scanning activity entirely. I think there is other activity that's kind of overlaying on this, where they're sort of pretending to look like the configure worm, but perhaps really aren't. Just looking for weak file shares that are exposed to the internet, perhaps doing, when I say weak, they have poor passwords, and so guessing the passwords, or maybe there's no password at all, or doing other things that perhaps to be able to exploit systems that hadn't been patched properly. So that's our show for today. I'd like to thank you for joining us. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at AT&T ThreatTraq@list.att.com, and
Just no fishes, please.
yeah, no fishes, please. Well, unless you think it's a really good example that we should share with you.
Right.
And but we certainly enjoy your feedback and your questions and perhaps suggestions for the program. You can find AT&T ThreatTraq on the AT&T Tech channel. It's on YouTube as well as on iTunes, and you can follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @ATT Security. I'd like to thank you, Michael Singer, for joining us today. We'd like to have you back again soon.
Good.
Joe Harten, thank you for joining.
All right. Yep.
John Hogoboom. I'm Brian Rexroad. We'll be back next week with a new episode, and until then, keep your network safe.